Hello and welcome to the Comic Cave. I'm Ramsey, aka Captain Away, and today I'm looking at the 1992 to 1993 story Superman: Funeral for a Friend. If you saw my last video for Death of Superman, or just read that comic I guess like a boring person that reads, then you know that that story just suddenly ended with the title being realized. Literally the moment that Superman collapsed dead, the comic ended. That left the 4 Superman titles running at the time, which again was Adventures of Superman, Action Comics, Man of Steel, and No Adjective Superman, without their title character for the foreseeable future. And with almost any other character, that would probably mean the end of those titles, but that wasn't what DC had planned for ol' Supes. The main plan would be coming later, as we'd see what would essentially be 4 pretenders to the throne rising up to fill in the void left by Superman. Before we got there though, DC decided that an event like the death of Superman needed some breathing room. So between those 2 major events was a unique event of its own, as all the titles took a step back and took some time to grieve the loss of the world's most powerful hero and try to find someone who could possibly be the hero Metropolis needed without its great guardian. So all the creative teams already working on those 4 titles would continue through into this story. So let's see how they choose to grieve for the Man of Steel and take this away. The comic immediately opens where the last one ended, with Superman lying dead on the ground near Doomsday surrounded by onlookers. This scene is such a big, groundbreaking, get it, groundbreaking, deal that seriously 3 of these issues will literally start at this exact place. Or I guess you could argue that they thought those comics would sell better if they tied in so directly to the death story, so I guess it depends on how cynical you are. The gathered crowd are already mourning their fallen hero, and nobody more so than Lois, who was having to try and hold the secret of just why she's so upset about Superman passing, since the person she's engaged to is actually Clark Kent. Dubalex, a telepath who was created by and also works for that Project Cadmus that I mentioned in my last video, is unable to detect any brain activity in Doomsday or Superman, despite some cops on the ground being afraid that Doomsday might somehow still be alive. Some medics appear to try and resuscitate Supes without a whole lot of luck. For some reason that I'm sure has absolutely nothing to do with his undoubtedly inevitable resurrection, he's maintained his invulnerability in death, so the electric shock paddles have no discernible effect on him. Professor Hamilton and Bibbo, 2 Marv Wolfman creations who have stuck around in the Superman comics as fairly prominent and popular side characters, also show up now with some bigger electric paddles, but even with some backup from those jetpack laser beam guys we saw in the previous story, providing some extra juice for their power source, the paddles still fail to bring any life back to Superman. I actually do enjoy this struggle though. It's an interesting concept, you know, the whole idea that Superman's invulnerability, the thing that has always kept him safe in his battles, could actually hurt him when someone needs to help him. While this is going on, in a nearby alley, Metropolis Police Inspector Turpin runs across the sack of purple alien thing that is Matrix, still too badly injured from that one punch from Doomsday to retake her normal form. Luthor shows up, showing a surprising amount of empathy, and takes her back to LexCorp where she can recover and shapeshift back into the Girl of Steel again. Among the onlookers on the scene where Superman died are Justice League members Ice and Bloodwind, who we saw watching the fateful events at the end of the previous story. Bloodwind quickly decides that they can't do anything to help Superman at this point, so he takes Ice, who is still horribly injured from her own fight with Doomsday, and teleports out of there. They go to JLA headquarters where Blue Beetle is in a coma and Booster Gold is unsure of his continued future as a superhero since his Future Man suit was destroyed fighting Doomsday. With word of Superman's death getting out, a bevy of other heroes show up to JLA headquarters, mostly previous Justice League members, especially all the big names like Wonder Woman, Batman, Aquaman, Hal Jordan, Hawkman, and members of the Justice Society. Oberon, who at this point was sort of the JLA's equivalent to Jarvis as the right-hand man of their organizer Maxwell Lord, shows up with little black armbands that he hands out to everyone so that they can demonstrate their mourning in this epic 2-page spread. And I guess they needed those armbands because I guess none of them had, just black superhero tights lying around. Except Batman, probably. Also, those of you who weren't alive at the time may not know this, but this is actually a little nod to physical issues of Superman number 75. Because the original physical issues were sold in sealed bags with little black armbands inside the bag that had the little bleeding S logo created for the Death of Superman event, so that people in the real world could show their mourning as well. And if anyone still has a sealed bag with armband of that comic, then I bet you feel really cool, don't ya? This series will also actually poke a little fun at DC for doing this later too, as at one point we'll see a street vendor selling bagged copies of the Daily Planet edition that first ran the story of Superman's death, and the copy comes complete with armband and t-shirt. Bibbo Bibowski, yes, that's his name, initially doesn't take kindly to this guy trying to capitalize on someone's death, because surely nobody was trying to do that. But after the guy tells Bibbo a little sob story, Bibbo ends up buying up the guy's entire stock and even offering him a job at Bibbo's bar, the Ace of Clubs, because that Bibbo is just a great big softie. After everyone fails to resuscitate Supes, Cadmus shows up, headed by the increasingly shady Paul Westfield. Westfield was supposed to be course-correcting Cadmus after its original leader, a guy named Dabney Donovan, broke bad and created a bunch of mutants and clones, but instead, Westfield is busy becoming a bit of a bad guy himself. Cadmus takes Doomsday's body away, and they try to take Superman's as well, but he's stopped from doing that by the police and the Golden Guardian, who is himself a clone that's supposed to be working for Cadmus. So Superman's body gets moved to the hospital morgue, where Westfield tries again to grab it for Cadmus. This time, he's stopped by Supergirl and some LexCorp's Rocket Men. With Superman dead, you might think that Lex Luthor would go all out on his evil ways, but I guess he keeps in check because of Supergirl still being around, because she's still somehow unaware of Lex's evil ways. Because she's a girl, so she's dumb. Or maybe because Matrix is only like 4 years old or something, and so still pretty naive. But that only really makes her relationship with Lex all the more gross. I mean, am I the only one here? Is this not super icky to anybody else? Okay. Anyway. My point is, it's a bit weird that Lex is acting so stringently to stop Cadmus from grabbing Superman's body because, as we will learn later, he knows that what Cadmus wants is to make a clone of Superman, and Lex wants that too, for reasons I'm sure make sense. After all, Lex is a clone himself, as he explains during this event for those who hadn't been following along, which was probably most people, since, Death of Superman exploded sales into new horizons. After getting radiation poisoning from using red kryptonite to take away Superman's powers, Lex Luthor was left with less than a year to live. But as the ultimate evil mastermind, Luthor faked his death while his associates kept his brain alive so that they could transfer his consciousness into a clone of himself. Not an exact clone though, clearly, as he got himself a new, more physically fit body covered in long flowing hair. Definitely not compensating for anything here. But with Superman's body secured, Lex agrees to foot the bill for the burial. This includes a giant golden statue over his grave and an entire funeral procession through the city, chaperoned by the various major superheroes. God dang, this JFK funeral art must have taken a long ass time to draw. No wonder some of it looks just a little bit on the sloppy side. Deadlines, Also, I can't imagine there aren't at least a few creator cameos in this crowd somewhere. Like, that definitely looks like this issue's writer Louise Simonson and her husband Walt. Tell me it's not. Although the heroes are here supposedly just to march with the coffin, they're really here so we could still squeeze some action into even this bleak emotional issue, as some ne'er-do-wells are there to cause some trouble. Because of course they are. And the crowd even erupts into a bit of a riot for no real reason. Maybe because President Clinton and Hillary are there, which shouldn't make sense, I feel, since, you know, he was elected in 1992, which would be the same year as this comic should have come out. Especially considering that we see in the next part of this story, it's Christmas, so, you know, that being after this and Bill Clinton not being inaugurated until January of 93, I don't see how he's already president here. Guess DC was just ready for the change. Who can blame them, really? Have you heard that man play saxophone? I haven't, but I understand that's a thing he did, I guess. Whatever. While Supes is being entombed in Metropolis, his poor parents are unable to even attend the funeral of their own son. So they have a metaphorical burial as they bury some of his stuff on their farm in Kansas. Much of the remaining story focuses on who will replace Superman now that he's gone, because apparently no one simply considered the concept of just trying to learn to be self-reliant. Instead, the entire city seems to have become codependent on Superman's mere presence. One of the obvious replacements is Supergirl, who even gets her name highlighted on an issue of Action Comics here. But her being at Luthor's beck and call prevents her from really having the chance to fill the gap. Also, you know, the fact that she doesn't really have the powers of Superman, she's just kinda able to fake it. There's also Golden Guardian, who takes to the street in his fancy future bike, but he has a similar problem in that he primarily works for the secretive Cadmus. Which is kind of a shame, really, because apparently he was an early example of body cam, since his motorcycle records everything around it to ensure he wasn't using excessive force. And after recording, it even burns everything to Laserdisc. To Laserdisc. Laserdisc. I love the 90s. Maybe he can make some backups on Betamax and record some audio on 8-track. Like me! Another potential replacement comes in the form of Sinbad. Sinbad is a young boy immigrant from the fictional Middle Eastern country of Kurak, himself only fairly recently introduced into the Superman continuity. There's also the newer version of Rose in Thorn, Rose being a regular woman and Thorn being her split personality. In the past, Thorn was always a villain, or maybe more accurately an anti-hero, with her focus being on stopping gang activity. The Thorn personality had vanished over the years, but with Superman dead, she suddenly resurfaces and brings back her fight against the gangs of Metropolis. And speaking of that, perhaps most of the focus of these various stopgap vigilantes is on Jose Delgado, better known as Gangbuster. He ain't afraid of no gangs. Delgado is notable because unlike with the other heroes trying to fill the void, the cops aren't appreciative of his assistance. Everyone seems to think he does more harm than good and that he's maybe too violent when stopping crime, which is interesting to me because we don't really see anything that he does that's more violent than anybody else. But nobody's getting mad at those other people. Feels more like they're just hating because he's the only one that's not, you know, pure white. At the start of this story, he was dating longtime Superman side character Cat Grant, who had convinced him to give up his nighttime lifestyle. But when he puts on his tights again following the funeral, they apparently break up. This eventually leads to GB getting himself in some serious trouble when he breaks up what he thinks is a drug deal, but turns out to be an undercover cop sting operation. This gets him fighting with cops and he's forced to go on the run, which gets him shot and nearly kills him when he leaps from a skyscraper down into the Metropolis Bay to escape the cops. He manages to survive, but at this point decides it might be best to listen to advice Inspector Henderson had given him earlier and leave town. Even Luthor gets in on the action. He attempts to sell to the city the concept of his own personal police force of superpowered rocket men, like his own private army of Iron Mans, like the ones we saw earlier protecting Superman's body from being taken by Cadmus. These troops would be aided by Supergirl and Lex Luthor himself in his own personal super suit. But on his first outing, Lex gets overconfident, showing off how cool his Robo-Men are and brings down the ceiling, literally. This will leave Luthor pretty wounded, including breaking his leg, something that will leave him wandering around in a wheelchair and wearing a cast for some time after this. But the main story of this arc, or at least the most important, is about Superman's body. Because even after having been told off twice, Westfield is unwilling to take no for an answer and has Cadmus agents drill a tunnel through the Metropolis underworld to Superman's crypt. They steal his body and go to work on it, attempting to find a way to clone the Man of Steel. They find it surprisingly difficult given that he still has his nigh invulnerability even in death, so obtaining a usable DNA sample becomes a challenge all on its own. Using some special laser beams directed at his eye, they manage to get something they claim will be usable, but it's stolen from them by the Newsboy Legion. To not go into too much detail, the Newsboy Legion, like the Golden Guardian, were Jack Kirby creations from the 1940s. These kids were literally newsboys in the original iterations, those kinds you see on movies shouting things like, "Extra, extra, read all about it!" Seeing as that's not a job anymore, in the post-Crisis on Infinite Earths timeline, both the Newsboys and Golden Guardian are said to be clones created by Cadmus of the original characters that were still said to have lived in the 40s, or the 50s. I don't know, timelines can be fuzzy. The point is, it seems Cadmus ends up losing the data on Superman's DNA, and before they can try again, Supergirl and Lois Lane show up to get Superman's body back. Let's go back to how we got to this point. Part of the reason Luthor was willing to foot the bill for the burial was so he could have full control over the burial site itself. This allowed him to build secret monitoring devices, which alerted him when there was activity in Superman's tomb, and secret entrances into the tomb. Using one of these, Supergirl learns that Superman is no longer in his tomb, with his entire coffin missing. She investigates along with Inspector Turpin and Henderson and a pre-leg injury Lex Luthor, and their investigation leads them through the tunnels dug by Cadmus until a mine planted to cover evidence goes off, collapsing the tunnel and flooding the underworld. Luthor saw the Cadmus logo on the mine, which really stupid to put that kind of branding on a device like that, but whatever. So he knows what's up, but he keeps that information to himself. The others want to keep news of Superman's disappearance a secret, but that's difficult given that his tomb is monitored day and night by a cult of Superman worshippers, who are already expecting him to rise again to lead us into salvation. This cult actually appeared before, and fairly recently, from the early 600s of Action Comics when Roger Stern and Curt Swan were releasing Superman stories as part of a weekly strip for the then weekly release title. By this point, the series had thankfully returned to a monthly schedule. With the cult catching wind of Superman's body going missing, Lois Lane also catches wind, and she launches her own investigation with help from some of those underworld mutants I mentioned last time. And together with the Newsboys, they break into Cadmus. I love early 90s action Lois. She spends so much of these stories based around Superman's death doing little more than freaking out or grieving, so it's easy for readers to not know she was prone to kicking ass and taking names at the time, often getting herself out of trouble rather than waiting for Superman to do it like in the old days. It was a nice change for the character, so I wish we got more of it here, but I embrace it when it happens anyway. Once Lois finds Superman's body at Cadmus and realizes what's going on, she writes an article about it to put pressure on Cadmus. But first she shows her evidence to Luthor, and now forced to face what Cadmus has done, he acts quickly, sending Supergirl and Lois into the building to retrieve what Cadmus stole. That just leaves us with one final bit of story. In a couple final issues for this arc, the tragedy only deepens as Superman's father, Jonathan Kent, suffers a heart attack out on the farm and collapses. While in a coma in the hospital, he has a long, vivid dream of being back in his old war days, on a mission to rescue an airman lost behind enemy lines. Instead, he continues to run across all the dead from throughout his life, including his own brother that I never knew he had, and who apparently died when he fell in front of their father's thresher. Oh God. What a sick and gruesome way to die! Yikes, why did you bring that up, comic? He also runs across the demonic Lady Blaze, another fairly recent addition to the Superman canon who had served as a devil to steal the souls of Jimmy Olsen and Perry White's son, Jerry. Yeah, that's right, Perry and Jerry. What of it? The implication here for readers who had been around long enough was that Superman's soul would also have been taken by Blaze, and certainly enough, Jonathan finds Superman being transported by demons to some weird Kryptonian afterlife. But Pa Kent manages to wake up Superman's soul and convinces him to abandon this dangerous future. And together the two make their way to a strange hole in the sky. Supes is stopped here from entering by the sudden appearance of Jor-El, who Superman immediately calls his true father. Rude. The guy who raised you is like right there, Supes. That's your true dad. Jor-El's just the guy who supplied the genetic material. Jeez, no respect. Jonathan fights off the image of Jor-El, and together he and Superman head through the dark portal. Immediately from here, we see Pa Kent wake up in the hospital, convinced that everything he experienced was real and that he had managed to save his son's soul and return it to the world. The others aren't convinced, for obvious reasons, but on her way back to Metropolis, Lois sees a mysterious Superman-esque streak in the sky. Upon landing, we're immediately exposed to several reports of supposed Superman sightings. There's a woman saved from being hit by a car in the park, a family saved from a tenement fire in Suicide Slum, a nuclear plant prevented from meltdown, and lastly, a woman saved from assault by a man who burst through the basement wall of her apartment building. Unsure of what to think at this point, Lois and Henderson go once again to check on Superman's tomb, only to once again find it empty. Although this time with the coffin still in place and no evidence of a break-in from Cadmus. Dun dun dun! Oh, I mean, that makes it time for the breakdown. I always think it's interesting when a comic company has the guts to run an issue of a series without its title character, or at the least a clear approximation of the title character. But this is basically 9 issues of DC doing exactly that. Superman's presence practically haunts every one of these stories, at one point quite literally. And that lets these issues hit differently than you would really expect from superhero comics at the time. It gives us a chance to really experience and feel just how much Superman meant to the various characters in his life as we spend time witnessing how each of them grieves in their own way. It lets us see how Metropolis reacts to not having its guardian angel, and the answer is not well. It's such an interesting tonal shift for comic books of the time period that it's hard to not see this as a necessary companion to the death of Superman. But it's not without its problems. Honestly, a lot of this comic is just boring. And not for the reasons DC clearly worried it would be. While I do give DC credit for taking a risk, they clearly weren't willing to risk it all. Several of these issues, like the issue with the actual funeral, should have taken more time to step back and let the events just happen. But DC clearly simply couldn't let an entire issue go by without forcing some superhero action into it. Which was all pointless anyway, because every single one of these replacement heroes that they add in vanishes from the main story following this series. And a lot of this does end up feeling like filler, like they just didn't want to get to the next part of the story too quickly. But even with that all said, overall I'm still giving this a series recommendation level of high. While it can feel like it's dragging, for the most part Funeral continues the trend DC started with Death of Superman of telling unique and powerful stories that challenge the concept of what a superhero comic could be. And that alone might make it worth reading before you even factor in the fact that it's a pretty good story in its own right. The collected edition gets 1 golden Superman statue. Even though that's basically his grave marker, I'm still going to consider that a good thing. Because this collection is 9 regular issues, a 10th issue that's the giant-sized issue 500 of Adventures of Superman, and 2 double-length specials, and still includes a little bonus art gallery in the back. It may not be the single greatest comic book collection in existence, but it's definitely hard to fault what it delivers. Thanks everybody for watching. I'm trying to pump these out as quickly as I can make them while still taking time to make them good. I don't want to trade quality for quantity, cause that's just not how I am. And I feel you guys can appreciate that since you've taken me so close to the big 1K subscribers. Please, please, please help me get there by subscribing to the channel and giving this video a thumbs up. It helps me, and it helps you by making sure you can be here next time, and I hope to see you then, right here, in the Comic Cave.